I'm a professor here in the History Department and affiliated with First Nations and Indigenous Studies. As always, I want to acknowledge our Musqueam hosts, Haitsepka Siem, and really start with that kind of acknowledgement of territory and presence here. And so today what we're going to do is share a little bit about what we've been doing the last couple of weeks, the last 4 weeks really, the group of 10 of us, and what we've been up to. And this is a chance for us to share our research and also some of our findings, things that we discover always being a complicated term, while we were in London. So I thought I would start with just a little bit of background about the story that we were interested in and then what we actually did in London, and then turn it over to the students who will have about 7 minutes each just to share some of their insights on our time in London. So what we were really interested in, and it's related to something that I think all of us are doing in our own work if we're working in Indigenous issues, is to try to indigenize stories that maybe aren't typically understood that way. And so for us, what we wanted to try to do was indigenize this space, to take the so-called center of empire, and really look at it from Indigenous angles. And the core of this was actually my research, a book that's coming out in October called Indigenous London. And it's about the history, it's the city's history framed through the experiences of Indigenous children, women, and men who traveled there willingly or otherwise from territories that became New Zealand, Australia, the US, and Canada. The story covers over 500 years. The first Indigenous travelers to London came in 1502, so just 10 years after Columbus's voyages. So very early history. Hey, welcome. And if you do need to come and go, that's totally fine. I know some of you need to leave early. So some of the people we looked at are quite well known. Probably the most well-known figure that we looked at in this research and on this trip was Mataoaka Rebecca Rolfe Pocahontas, who traveled to London in 1616 as part of a reconnaissance mission on behalf of her Powhatan people. Hey guys, and hey. And died in Gravesend, just outside of London in 1617. Other people that we researched and that we read about in the course are far less well known, and in some cases even unnamed. For example, an Odawa war captive who was 11 years old, brought to London and used kind of as really entertainment in the home of his captor/host. And the statues here at Westminster Abbey were actually modeled after him. And so that story is very poorly known. There's not much evidence about him, and so on. So we were really working with both highly visible figures and ones that were not so visible. And some of these are a bit dark. The projector here is a bit off. These were figures, these were people who were highly visible in their day. Many of them came as diplomatic missions. For example, the four kings, they're often called the four Mohawk kings, although they were not all Mohawk. And they were highly visible. Everything they did was printed in the newspapers. Their speeches to Queen Anne were printed and passed around the city. So they were absolutely celebrities. And one of the things we were really interested in is what this tells us about London life as well. So after these four men leave and return home, within a couple of years there's a large outbreak of gang violence in London. And one of the most rapacious gangs, the most famous ones, call themselves the Mohawks. So all kinds of interesting ideas about so-called savagery, ideas about freedom from the law, and so on. So there are always ways in which these travelers are shaping how Londoners think about themselves as well. We were really interested in trying to get at what Indigenous travelers to London thought of the experience. So we looked at the first-person accounts of people like Samson Occam on the left here, who was a Mohegan minister who traveled in 1766 and kept a journal. Other times it's a little harder to know what Indigenous travelers thought of the place. A man like Atayuk, for example, an Inuit person who was brought in 1772, we have to sort of read between the lines of his host, the person who brought him, in order to really get at what he thought of the city. And then Tyndonegea, or Joseph Brant, the Mohawk political and military leader, made 2 trips to London. And again, we don't have his first-person voice, but we have lots of information about what he was up to in the city, becoming a Freemason, doing archival research of his own, and so on. We also looked at people from other territories. By the 19th century, the beginning of the 19th century, there's a Maori presence in London, beginning 1806-ish, and also a Hawaiian presence in London. The King and Queen of Hawaii, who are here at the top, died in London in 1824 and were laid in state at St. Martin in the Fields and Trafalgar Square, one of the sites that we visited. Maori performers, Maori converts to Christianity who were given a lot of attention in the press, Queen Emma of Hawaii, and so on. And what's interesting about these stories is how Hawaiian and Maori rituals intersected with urban rituals. So everything from table etiquette to funeral rites and so on. These rituals really came together. We also looked at how in the late 19th and early 20th century, Londoners became very anxious. As their city became more suburban, they became very anxious about what it meant for suburban male bodies to be able, as they got kind of softer and more, quote, civilized, would they be strong and sort of robust enough to actually manage the empire. And so there's a lot of anxiety about male bodies in the city at the same time that Indigenous athletes were being brought to the city and in many cases winning against their British competitors. So a Seneca long distance runner, Aboriginal Australian cricket team, mostly Maori rugby team, and then the Wild West show performers of the late 19th, early 20th century, many of whom were Lakota. And then we also looked at how these travelers are remembered in descendant communities today. So for example, in 2006, the Mohegan tribe of Connecticut unveiled, well actually the Queen, Elizabeth II, unveiled this stone monument to a Mohegan diplomat who had traveled to London in 1736 but died of smallpox before he could present his land petition to the king at the time. And so that land petition was actually finally presented in 2006. And it's really clear that while London has kind of forgotten its empire in many cases, and many of these stories have been forgotten by present-day Londoners, that's still really prevalent or present within Indigenous communities today, many of the stories of these travelers. So for example, stories of Pocahontas that are held within descendant communities. The case of Mahomet is another one. So what did we actually do while we were in London? We had a pretty full schedule. Almost every day we were doing things. So we began the tour, the trip with a walking tour of the city based on the book that they had read the first week. They read the manuscript to the book. And so we did a walking tour that started at Covent Garden, went through Trafalgar Square, went to Westminster Abbey, then we went to St. Paul's, we went to the Museum of London, and so on. And it was a chance for people to actually start to connect the stories that we'd heard about with the actual places where these things happened. We were all very jet lagged this day too. We went to visit the Royal College of Physicians to look at the personal library of this man, John Dee. He's the man who in the 1570s coined the phrase the British Empire. And so his library was on display for the first time since his death in 1609. So we went and looked at his library and tried to think about what kind of empire was he imagining. Very strange figure. Communicated with angels in his own mind and tried to really imagine what the future of the British Empire could be. So we were able to look at his personal effects. This is not a good picture at all, but one of the things that we were able to do was take a walking tour of an area of the city called Bermondsey in Rotherhithe. And in the early 19th century, a tunnel was built under the Thames in this neighborhood. And in 1843, some Ojibwe visitors were taken into the tunnel to sort of impress them into submission with British technological superiority. Instead, they took the entrance, which is what this is. It's a little hard to see, but it's a big circular room that's the entrance to the tunnel. And they called it the Great Medicine Cave and performed dances and songs there and kind of really incorporated it in quite easily into their old worldview, or their own worldview. So we were able to actually go into the space just very briefly and get a sense of that space. We took a trip to Gravesend, which is a little bit east of London, downriver, and that's where Pocahontas is buried. And so we spent a day really thinking about her story, different accounts of her story, and it was a chance for us to really connect with her presence. Including some of the students engaged in some sort of ceremony, really, to acknowledge her presence and to connect with her in that way. It was quite a powerful day. We made a trip to the British Library. Curators at the British Library pulled out materials that were related to the travelers that we were reading about. So, for example, a document that was signed by the four kings using their clan symbols instead of English writing. So we were able to look at things like that, to look at old maps from the 18th and early 19th centuries and so on. And I know that for most of the students, they haven't had direct archival experience prior to this. So it was, I think, really powerful for a lot of us, as it's always been for me as a researcher, to actually be able to kind of touch material that the people we're working on also touched. We were interested in a kind of parallel story. And so on the Monday of the second week, we did a walking tour of Black history in London with a man named Tony. I can't remember his last name. But this was a really interesting engagement where he was really talking about the colonial history of the city, the relationship between enslavement and the growth of the cities through things like sugar, for example, which I think you'll hear a little bit more about today in student presentations. And we really talked a lot about the parallels, but also some of the differences between Black history in London and Indigenous history in London. There was some really good back and forth between the students. At one point, he started talking about the residential school system in Canada, for example, and so some of the students were able to sort of share stories and so on about that. So it was really a conversation. Then we went to the British Museum. We don't have any pictures of our time there. This is the Great Court at the British Museum. The British Museum is, as we all might imagine, an intensely imperial and colonial space. And so we met with a couple of curators there, Gay Sculthorpe, who is a Palawa woman from Tasmania, who is the curator of Oceania there, and then Amber Lincoln, who's the curator of the Americas, and talked kind of about the politics of representation, questions of repatriation, and so on. It was a very different experience, and students will talk about this, from a trip we took later that week to the Pitt Rivers Museum, which is in Oxford. We made a day trip to Oxford. And here we have Dempsey Bob, who is Tanya's father, who came along for part of the trip, a really important carver from Tahltan and Tlingit nations. Here he's talking about an object that's being held by Laura Peers, one of the curators. And we spent some time with cultural belongings there. And I would say that this, for many of us, I think was the peak of the trip. It was a really powerful experience, and I know some of you will probably talk a little bit about that. And then we ended the 2 weeks in London with kind of a bookend. We had started with a walking tour that I led based on my work, and then we ended the trip with a walking tour that the students led based on their own choices of sites that they were interested in and research about those sites. So we did the site of Bedlam Hospital, we did St. Paul's Cathedral, we did the Tower of London, we did the National Gallery. I'm seeing if I can remember all of these. The National Gallery, the British Museum, a site at Marble Arch, which was the site of the great hanging gallows called the Tyburn Tree. We talked about the Canadian War Memorial. And then we also talked about Buckingham Palace itself. So we were all over the city. It was a 6-hour walking tour. And we were all completely exhausted by the end of that. So we kind of bookended the trip with really trying to ground this history in the places and in our own sort of bodies in these places. So that's what we were involved with. That's kind of the overview. But what I'd like to do now is really turn it over to the students to talk about their experience. Again, they're going to talk 7 minutes each or so. We're going to try to keep to that. And if you need to step up and get some food while we're talking, that's totally fine. We'll need to shift the microphones around a bit. And then what we'll do after the students have presented is do kind of a collective question and answer period, because I'm sure many of you will have questions about the experience. So we'll start with Owen. just on your shirt.
Cool. All right, start whenever I'm ready?
Yep.
Okay, hello. My name is Owen Bedard. I am half Haida on my dad's side and half Tsimshian on my mom's side. I was born in Prince Rupert, British Columbia, and I grew up in a small village called Lukwilams, just on an island outside of Prince Rupert. This September, I'll be starting my 4th year here at UBC. I am enrolled in the NITEP program, studying to become a high school history teacher. And so yeah, let's get into it. So I'll start off by talking about what my notions of Indigenous London were before the class had started. So I've taken a lot of history courses in my 4 years here at UBC, and all the ones that revolved around the British Empire and Indigenous histories of North America, they all focused on what Britain had to impact, or Britain's impact in North America. And so I have very limited knowledge beforehand on what the Indigenous impact in London was. So I was very excited and very interested to see how that would play out and see all this cool stuff. And so I was excited to have a new perspective on history. And so you can go to the next slide. So I'll talk about a few things. Like Coll was saying, we visited many different places while we were in London. The places we visited were where Indigenous people from North America, New Zealand, and Australia had traveled to. And when we were at these places, we got to see what the impact was, how they shaped London society, even if it was a hidden history. And so now I want to talk about a few of my favorite places. The first place I'll talk about is the British Library. So for me, surprisingly, the British Library was one of my favorite things that we did. I know when I was looking at the syllabus, I didn't think it would be all that exciting. I was like, oh, we're going to a library. But as soon as I walked in, I was just amazed at the size of the building alone, and I thought it was just so cool. And the curator, when he was talking to us, he told us that they had roughly 350 million archives in their possession, and I was absolutely blown away by that. And so while we were at the museum, we got to go behind the scenes and go into a back room where we got to see all these documents that they had. And so the documents we saw, they were maps from the 18th century of North America. We got to see some hand-drawn portraits like this one here of the Indigenous people we were reading about. And we also got to see the deed, which was signed by 3 of the 4 kings. And I just thought it was so cool to see, like Coll was saying, just to handle stuff that they have handled themselves. And so I just thought it was so cool. And that was by far one of my favorite experiences, especially as a historian studying history for 4 years. I thought it was so cool. So you can go to the next slide. Now I want to talk about museums. So our trips to the 2 museums also stuck out to me. Our first trip was to the British Museum, and our second one was while we were at Oxford at the Pitt Rivers Museum. And those stood out to me because they brought out such mixed feelings for me. On one hand, I just thought it was so cool to see all these Indigenous artifacts and all these art pieces that the museum had preserved for so long. And I know if they weren't in a museum, I wouldn't have seen them otherwise. And so I thought it was kind of cool to see that. But then on the other hand, it wasn't a very comforting feeling to know that they were just somewhere they shouldn't be. Like they didn't belong to the museum, but they were still claimed as museum property. And they also were acquired through questionable means, like some of them were taken without permission. And I also learned while I was there that they were injected with pesticides to preserve the objects, and so you couldn't even handle them without wearing gloves, and to me that just wasn't right. And so, I don't know, it just brought out such mixed feelings for me, so I'm not sure how to feel about museums. And while we were in our classes, we discussed intensely the idea of repatriation and whether or not the objects should be returned, and so I just thought it was really cool. It was a cool experience. And so, but it was also at the museum I managed to discover a personal connection, so you can go to the next slide. So when we were at the British Museum, we had a bit of downtime because we were always early wherever we went, so we had about an hour to look around. So I was excited. First thing I wanted to do was go to the Indigenous North American exhibit, because being the proud Haida I am, I wanted to see some cool Haida stuff. And they did have some cool Haida stuff. They had like bentwood boxes, and they had this cool sphinx mixed with a bentwood box. And so when we were in the Great Hall, you walk around the corner and I saw a big totem pole, and I knew right away by looking at the figure at the top that it was a Haida pole. So I got all excited to see that. So I walked up to that to read the little plaque at the bottom. And reading it, I discovered that it was purchased from my great-grandfather, Chief Wea. And so I got really excited over that. The first thing I did was I took some pictures and sent them to my mom and dad right away. And when they got back to me, they sent me a bunch of like pictures and a bunch of books and all this other stuff. And it was just really cool. I got to learn so much about my family's history and some Haida culture. And I just never thought that would happen, me going to London, getting to learn more about who I am and who my family is. And so the the British Museum, the Haida Museum.
Classic Haida.
The British Museum became my site interpretation for our longest day of the student-led walking tour, because I was really excited to share that personal connection with the rest of the class. And as you can see, there it is. Looks great. So last thing I want to talk about is moving forward from here. So as I mentioned before, I am studying to become a high school history teacher. And during our time in London and all this week after, I've been reflecting on how I'm going to use this experience moving forward into a career of education. And one thing I'm really taking away is the new outlook on history. Because for me, I've always just looked at it through the North American lens and how Britain impacted over here. And so I'm really excited that I learned all this stuff about London and that I get to share it as a history teacher. And so yeah. I also took a lot away from my classmates too, because the class was filled with so many people from different areas and different faculties that I was able to see their perspectives as well, apart from mine. And I was just so surprised at how much I learned from them alone. So I just want to finish off by saying thank you, especially to Coll and Tanya, because I know they did a ton and they took out a lot of time and effort to make sure everything went okay and our course, everything was smoothly, and it was just fantastic. So thank you. There you go.
Okay. Okay, Mom, put the camera away. Okay, so thank you all for coming and welcome here, and I'm so thankful for you all here and coming and witnessing everything that we've learned. My name is Faith. I'm from the Musqueam Nation, and we're actually on my territory right now, and I'm going into my 5th year in First Nations and Indigenous Studies. I have to get used to that. And I have always been very proud of my Musqueam culture. I've been raised by amazing people. My Sparrow family is massive, starting with my grandmother, my grandfather, all the way down to the great-grandchildren. There are 71 of us, and we all live like within 10 blocks of each other. So you can kind of get the sense that I've been raised by a very strong family. Not just the ones who are with me every day, but the ones who have passed before me. I have been raised to know everything that they wanted me to know about this land and taking forward my traditions. And often when I introduce myself, this is how I introduce myself. I assert my Musqueam indigeneity. But I'm sure you can tell by the looks of me, I don't really look all that native. And most people, when I give this introduction, they're like, well, you don't look Indian. And so I have to tell them that I am actually part European, I have European descent. And this was something that I was aware of coming into this class, but didn't really understand the impact of this. I came into Indigenous London filling out the application saying it would be really interesting to learn my other half. But I really didn't know what that meant or how much I would learn and how much my histories are intertwined, as separate as they may seem. You can move on to the next slide. So This trip to London was really completely eye-opening for me in regards to my family histories on both sides. And how, like I said, how closely tied they are, even though they might not seem that way. And this became most apparent on one specific day in London. I noticed throughout the trip how different cultures are. I mean, my culture and how rooted I am in it. But it became especially apparent of my European descent when we went to Oxford. These are my family members. I want to give an explanation of them. These are my great-grandfathers. On my mother's side, this is my great-grandfather Edward Sparrow and her father Willard Sparrow. And then on this side is my father's grandfather Frederick Crawford and his dad Francis Crawford. Francis and his brother both went to Oxford University at different colleges, Balliol and Trinity. And I was really excited when I saw on the syllabus that we were going to be going to Oxford. My grandfather just passed away just about a year ago, and I wasn't all that close to him my entire life. Like I've said, I've always lived on the Musqueam Reserve, and he lived far away for most of it. And I was excited to get this opportunity to kind of connect myself to him in a way that I'd never been before. And I really didn't know how much I would be surprised. I walked around the campus imagining him being there. And then I started thinking about, wow, I have ties to this land. And I'd never, ever thought that before. I've always been so tied to this land. And I'd never really thought that I could be from somewhere else because I've been so wrapped in love by my ancestors. And I'm going to cry because we went to the Pitt Rivers Museum and I was heartbroken that my two sides of my family were so different but so close together. I was on this land where my grandfather walked, and then here in these cases were my other ancestors. I think there's another picture. This shows the stark differences between my two sides of my family. I mean, this is my great-grandfather walking with the Queen Mother. He was a colonial administrator and was the governor of Uganda and Seychelles, and I can't remember where else. And then the next picture is a picture of my grandfather Willard, and this was him planning Musqueam's lot for the very first native housing. So just very different histories, but I really became aware of them both on the next picture here. These cases were so full of Indigenous artifacts. But to us, they're living beings. And so I had my ancestors trapped in these cases. And meanwhile, my grandfather would have been walking freely out on these streets. And it was just such a stark realization that I had two different ties to this land. One, my blood is from here, and the second, my blood was taken here. And it was just incredibly difficult to walk through this museum. Dempsey, I was so glad that Tanya's dad, Dempsey, came with us. We were outside of the museum, about to walk in, and I was like, you walk in, you see this big pole at the very end, and I really had to amp myself up to walk in. And he looked at me and he said, they really just want to come home with us. And my heart shattered. And as you walked through there, I kept explaining this to everybody, it felt like you were walking through butter because the energy was so strong. And so it was just a really strange realization for me. And it started really complicating for a second I was really complicating my history. I mean, I never really asserted my European descent because of how insecure I am of my looks and having to always assert my indigeneity, because people don't understand that just because I don't look native doesn't mean that I can't be Musqueam through and through. So on the plane ride home, I did really realize what that meant, like reading different readings that we were assigned, and they were very helpful for me to understand how I was feeling, and realizing that I wasn't the only person feeling this. I read a piece that she explored her two sides of indigeneity by an author, Maya McDashie. But while I was here, although my identity was complicated, I was also really strengthened. My Musqueam culture was really, no matter what, I always kept going back to it in my mind. The next picture, I chose Tiburn, which on our last day. And it just showed the stark contrast between cultures. Here was a place of mass execution for criminals, and Indigenous people would not have been taken here to view this, because it would have just showed the savagery of the British Empire and how they would just massively drive up criminals to be hung, and then their bodies would be grabbed at by thousands of people who were there to witness it. And that is just not how we do it. We try to rehabilitate our criminals. They're still people, they're still our family. So to me, I was just really strengthened in my Musqueam culture, and I'm being told that I'm talking too much, so I'm done. But I want to thank you so much for coming and wanting to learn more about what we learned, because it really just changed me, not on an academic level, but on a personal level. And I'm so thankful to both of you for putting forth this amazing course. Thank you.
I really feel like a real lecturer up here. Yeah. Let's see. All right. Okay, so good morning. My name is Joe Stevens. I wish I could give a more grand introduction like Dr. Joe Stevens, but I'm actually still in my undergrad, so we'll kind of leave it at that this morning. But my name is Joe Stevens. I come from Vancouver Island. I grew up in between Qualicum Beach and Tofino, but my people are from Anishinaabe-Algonquin from Quebec. So I guess I would like to give you guys, my Indigenous London that I took away was one site. So I guess we could go into it. It was the Tower of London, what became my Indigenous London. And that can be kind of an interesting thing to understand, because the Tower of London doesn't exactly come across as the most Indigenous space. In fact, this is actually one of the most colonial spaces there are. This is a site that, as you can see in this picture, was built to look over empire. In the city of London, looking across the Thames, looking across the English Empire from across into their colonial empire. This was a space that was built to signify power, strength, and to people that came here, it was meant to almost put them into awe and submission, to look in this space, to say that this is all the strength that we have here. You can't do anything kind of against this site. So I guess kind of looking into a space that has gone from being the first kind of fortress that was built in London, England, to today being the site of the crown jewels, how does that kind of fit into our story about Indigenous London? And I think this story kind of begins with three individuals. So these three individuals are Sir Walter Raleigh, who was a member of, going back into history, kind of Queen Elizabeth I's court. He was an explorer. Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland. He was known as the Wizard Earl for his focus on scientific experiments. But then the one person that kind of intrudes into this colonial space is this person, Pocahontas. So she fits into this narrative. When she came to London, she was brought into this colonial space of the Tower of London, but she did not kind of give into the ideas that they were trying to portray there. She maintained her own agency coming into this space. She went there with her own interests as a cultural ambassador, as a diplomatic ambassador, and in many ways we can see that she extended the sovereignty of the Powhatan Nation into this colonial space, in a way indigenizing this space. And that's a pretty powerful thing to look at that the people that built this structure and the kings and queens that kind of maintained it, in their eyes, there would have been no reason that they would ever see an Indigenous woman using her own agency to enter this space and to almost maybe lecture these people here about her empire, where she came from, her family and her nation. So for me, that kind of became Indigenous London. And it's very interesting for me because as a history major, I always like to visualize histories. So when I visit places here around Vancouver, I like to envision the Indigenous histories that are buried underneath it. I like to kind of envision what I can see there. So if we go into our next picture here, we can actually see the space that Pocahontas would have entered into. So this is actually, they've maintained it to this day of the, what was Sir Walter Raleigh's cell, or his room. And we can imagine her entering into this space and bringing her own Indigenous presence, extending her own sovereignty of the Powhatan people into this space right here. So that's a very interesting thing to look into. And after her, it almost became, as it is today, a tourist site to bring Indigenous people to, in the way that they would bring Indigenous travelers to the city, to this site, to show off the power and strength of the British Empire. But what I found again and again when going through Coll's book, or just on my own research, was that Indigenous people didn't play into this idea of power and empire and of submission. They held their own agency. And one of the most poignant ways of seeing that was the two princes that visited London, who would eventually become King Kamehameha IV and V of Hawaii, were brought to this space. They were brought around the entire city. And when asked by the royal family if they had seen anything of note while in the city, they said that they did not. So they held their own agency. They held that they had strength themselves in their own nations and said that, you know, you guys aren't this all-powerful being that controls this entire city. So I think that was kind of my biggest turning point in this tour, was getting to see how this colonial space that today is still marketed as this powerful fortress that was impenetrable and never fell, how Indigenous people were able to come into it, extend their own agency, reappropriate different parts of this building, and indigenize it themselves. So if we kind of go into our last slide here, this is kind of how it looks today. And I guess the part I'd like to leave with all of you on is, it's kind of hard to see it, but focusing right here is actually the current City Hall of London. So if you go into the Tower of London and you take the tour, you get to interact with their tour guides. They wear the funny hats, that kind of thing. I wasn't really interested in that. But anywho, you go in and you look out on one of the first kings that lived there. His name was Edward I. If you look out of his bedroom window, you look out exactly on City Hall. So to British people today, this still signifies the power of the United Kingdom, the power of maybe Christian empires, the power of the British Empire. And for me, it was important to look at this space and to be able to visualize how these histories and how this space has been indigenized by Indigenous travelers to the city. So I guess that's kind of my presentation today. So thank you all for coming out. And I want to thank again to Tanya and Coll. They were incredible on our trip and really gave me a lot of ideas that I probably will shape the rest of my university time. So, thank you.
Hi everyone, like others have shared, thank you all so much for coming out to witness some of the work that we've been doing around Indigenous London today. My name is Sarah and I'm really grateful to have the opportunity today to both learn and share with you on Musqueam territory. I'm a settler of mostly Scottish and English descent, so it was a bit weird going here without necessarily knowing a lot about that history. But I'm just really excited to share about a city that is physically so far removed, but as you've seen today, really deeply intertwined with the land we're on today. So when I was applying and preparing to participate in Indigenous London, I was thinking a lot about a course I took with Glenn Coulthard, who's an FNIS faculty member, called Theorizing Indigenous Politics, in which he had us consider how Western political theory, including liberalism, Marxism, feminism, and anarchism, had been used both to justify the dispossession of Indigenous peoples' lands and self-determining authority, and then on the other hand, to also resist or refuse those dispossessions. And all of those political frameworks are really deeply embedded and have strong ties to London, either in their development, so with liberalism and John Locke, or in deployment. So what I was hoping that I might do in London was continue the work of trying to make bridges out of missed connections, of exploring instances where my political or blood ancestors had missed or were continuing to miss opportunities to understand struggles as intertwined, or to see ethical imperatives to support Indigenous people's struggles. So if I can get you to go to the next slide. So I rounded up all the radical bookstores, libraries, and archives that I could find online, and I was ready to head to London. I didn't have the time or the energy to actually make it to as many of these places that I wanted to. I think I made it to 4. I'll talk a bit about the 56A info shop at the bottom. I made it to Gaze the Word and Houseman's Bookshop, and then New Beacon at the top, which was founded in 1966 by a Trinidadian by the name of John LaRose. And as I started visiting these places, I wasn't immediately finding what I was looking for. I wasn't seeing narratives that resonated with me or that I thought were especially useful, at least under the labels of feminism or Marxism or anarchy. So if I can get you to go to the next slide. This was partly because there was such a dearth of intersectional material in a lot of these spaces under those labels. This is from the 56A info shop, and the gender, feminism, relationship sections are totally empty, while the anarchy section on the left that's cut off is packed with just reprinted essays by white men. And I should explain also that these are zines, just kind of pamphlet type creations that contain and share knowledge, poetry, images, songs, anything under the sun, often compiled in a collage-like fashion, but come in all sorts of layouts and designs, and I brought some today if you want to look at them later. And one of the ones I brought is one I ended up finding in this space about mixed race, queer and feminist experience, which I thought was really important. If I could get you to the next one, and these are just some of the other ones that I found. And I found that zine because I started instead to pay more attention to aesthetic and just give myself permission to be drawn to things that looked interesting to me rather than seeking out those specific labels of political theory, even if the content of these zines wasn't necessarily the theory stuff that I was looking for. And I think I was able to find more meaningful content that way because these zines themselves, in their structure, in their content, and in their context, embody really important methodologies. They're pretty clearly labors of love that often seek to reuse or use readily available materials, to incorporate textual forms that aren't necessarily valued in other spaces, and are meant to be shared. And I think they engage with messiness in really cool ways. They also allow for different citational practices. There's just a lot, I think, that can be really powerful about them. So on my way back from London, I started to process that the methodologies that these zines embody overlaps with a lot of what we talk about and learn in FNIS, and that I'm still learning to put into practice. Ensuring that you're not the only one benefiting from knowledge that you receive by sharing it with others in ways that are appropriate and accessible, being intentional and prepared, but letting go of unproductive perfectionism, which I'm pretty bad at, and just generally being resourceful and present and critically engaged and reflective. And zines are especially appealing to me, or have come to me anyways. I'm pretty new to zines, I haven't interacted with them much before. Especially appealing as a way to share knowledge as an introvert. They allow for ways of showing and expressing full thoughts in both text and imagery in a way that I'm not as able to do in conversation. And instead of leaving that as a purely theoretical valuing of zines, I'm trying to put it into practice by making my own zine for the first time. So it's kind of washed out, but I'm working on a zine about Indigenous London as a way, in addition to this presentation, to practice reciprocity with the people who made it possible for me to go on this trip. My classmates, people in FNIS, my family, my housemates. And this page is where I'm starting. Coll mentioned we did site interpretations, and my site was Bedlam, which was a psychiatric institute that some of the Indigenous visitors were brought to. And I used that site as a way to draw together narratives of enlightenment, reasonableness, or rationality that were used both against Indigenous peoples to dispossess their land and against British non-normative citizens, in both cases, to literally remove them from public life. In other pages of the zine, I'll get to cite and reference communities and people in zines in London that inspired me, talk about the ethics of engaging in DIY culture as a white settler, and draw upon the journaling that Coll had us do while we were in London. So essentially, I went to London looking for theory, but instead found methodology, methods, and praxis. And maybe through doing zines, I'll get back to that theory eventually. But as I'm finishing up my degree and preparing to take a step back from school, at least for a little while, I think probably putting theory to practice is what I needed to find and engage in on this trip. So I'm happy that that worked out. So thank you.
Again, if you want to step up and grab some food at any time during, feel free.
Okay. So hello everyone, my name is Paige and I am a 4th year sociology student. So I really don't have that much of a background in history or First Nations and Indigenous studies. This was really the first class I had taken of the sort, and overall it was a really wonderful experience in which I learned a lot, and this presentation I really wanted to be sort of a testament to what I learned. So I'm going to kind of take you through the journey of like what my goals were at the start of this class and kind of where I ended up at the end of it. So the first slide. So I just wanted to say that like when I first started out for this class, one of my goals was that I really wanted to be disoriented. So I wanted to kind of challenge my assumptions about my surroundings and my assumptions about London, and really like push myself to see things in a different way. So this process started for me on our first walking tour that we took. So this was a walking tour that we took with a man named Tim, and it was around the suburb of Bermondsey, which I know Coll touched on earlier. And so during this tour, I kind of felt like something was off. Like my intuition was a little bit like, I guess, on edge, and I felt like the language that I was hearing was like the dominant discourse of Britain in a lot of ways, but I didn't really know how to like critique that in a way that my lack of knowledge and my lack of background in history, a lot of the references were going over my head, and I didn't really feel like I knew how to like articulate what I was feeling until I kind of learned from my classmates afterwards. We had a debrief and we were talking about it, and I kind of went, oh, like now I get it. Like now I know that my intuition was right, and like what I was hearing was, and like what I was thinking, it wasn't just me. Yeah, so that was our walking tour with Tim. And I definitely felt disoriented after that, like not in a good way either. Like I kind of was like, oh, I don't know about this. So, and then we got into our second walking tour with a man named Tony, and it was a very different experience. I think that it was very engaging, and it felt like very much like a horizontal conversation that we were having. And it disoriented me, but in a good way, because I think I felt more connected with the place that we were visiting, the Docklands. And actually Tony told us a story about, well, not a story, like he was sharing some history with us about the Docklands, about how, like I think it was about the international trade, like slave trade at the time, and I think it was Africans would come over with sugar on the boats, and the sugar would harden over time into these like cement-like bricks, and people were forced to take these cement-like bricks on their backs and essentially just drag them up the alley to the docks. But in the process of doing that, the cement-like sugar would scrape their backs, and they would bleed everywhere up this alley, to the point where the alley was renamed Blood Alley, or it was nicknamed Blood Alley. And that was something that really stuck with me and definitely changed the way I was seeing my surroundings. And that was really the main part that I took away from that tour. So that was the next slide. And so as I had been talking about up until then, I had a really hard time trying to articulate what I was feeling, but I think when we got to the British Museum, it was very, very clear to me what was bugging me about that and what was wrong about it, because it's so obvious when we walked into the British Museum that there are just a lot of possessions that are not at home and they're not supposed to be there, and they were taken under questionable circumstances, and that they should be repatriated, and that there are things that are just not where they're supposed to be. And I don't know, it wasn't like I felt disoriented, but I felt like that things around me were disoriented. I think so. I kind of had like that other perspective shift with the British Museum. So here's the next slide. And so I did, you can see it's a great photo of me. So we did I don't know why I picked this photo. We did our final site interpretations. And I picked St. Paul's Cathedral. So the reason I picked this site was because Indigenous visitors were brought to St. Paul's Cathedral and really brought up to the top of St. Paul's Cathedral so that they could be impressed into submission, as a quote from Coll. As the same as with on the walking tour with Tim, there was the Thames Tunnel, or the Great Medicine Cave, that was also used to impress visitors into submission by British architecture and British landscape. And I really, this was a turning point for me, because I had gone to St. Paul's Cathedral on my own time, and I felt very so in awe of this place, and so really impressed, at the point where I didn't even know how to explain to other people how impressed I was. But then after reading Coll's book and really thinking about it and looking back on it, I had to think about, is that a colonial mindset? Is that a good thing to be so in awe of this place? And I'm not really questioning for who is this place for, and who does it serve, and what's the history behind this place. So that was another learning point for me. So if we can go to the next slide. And so eventually what happened is that at the end of the trip, I took at the end of the London trip, I did my own trip to Bath, and I went there to visit some of my friends who have lived in England their entire lives and are very British. And we took a tour to a Georgian townhouse. It was just a townhouse from the Georgian period, and we went inside and we were able to go take a tour around. And I just kind of felt like I wasn't seeing the place in the same way that everyone else was, because we went into this dining room and there was a little cup of sugar on the table, and all I could think about was back to that Dockland story of Blood Alley, and that was all I could see when I was looking at the table, and all I could see was the tea that was on the table and all the history behind that. And I just kind of felt like the whole thing was almost staged in a way, and I just felt obviously it was staged. It was actors everywhere, but I felt like I wasn't getting the whole picture. I wasn't, even though that they were trying to tell us this history, I didn't feel like I was really seeing what was actually there, or what had actually happened. And that was when I realized that that all of we had been talking about, and all the critical theory and all the challenging assumptions, that had really kind of worked its way into my head, and it was kind of manifesting itself in a way that I didn't expect it to. And that was when I realized that I was disoriented, and that if we can go to the next slide, that I had achieved disorientation, which kind of brings up the question, can you really achieve disorientation? Is it something that, is there a limit, which is there's a threshold, I am now disoriented, but I don't know. I definitely felt that way, but in some ways, what does that mean for my academic career? And I think that the thing I took away from this is that I really learned that sort of throwing myself into the deep end and really being disoriented is where the most learning takes place. And that's something that I'm really happy I had this experience, and I'm really glad that I was able to take that away. And I think even just what Sarah was saying about sharing knowledge and how that's really important part of it. And I think that that was another thing that I learned from this class too. It's really important that we can all learn from each other. And I learned so much from this class. It was a great experience, and thank you so much, Coll and Tanya. It was really awesome. So yeah, that's all I have to say. Thank you all for listening to me.
Hello, everybody. My name is Kyla Shields. My ancestral name is Spipolina, which I'm just starting to find meaning behind and substance behind. It means little rabbit from my traditional territory of the Okanagan. Both my parents from the Okanagan territory, so we've been there for thousands of years. Thank you all for coming here, and I'm excited to share what I found in London. So this is a picture from the British Museum. I know some people touched on it, but I'm going to do something that might explain a little bit further, I guess, my feelings and understandings of the museum. So during the entire trip, the thing that resonated with me the most was our trips to the British Museum and the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. But our visits to both museums were completely different from one another. I have my own experience working in museums. I worked in my band's heritage repository, so I kind of used that experience to contrast what I found at the British Museum and the Pitt Rivers Museum. Okay, you can do the next one. So at the British Museum, in our meeting, we are mostly talked at rather than talked with or included in the conversation, which immediately showed us that there was like a very strong hierarchy in place. The curators played a PowerPoint for us, and one of the images that struck me the most was some very old bentwood boxes, and one of them was wrapped in chains and rope, which I think there was a lot of symbolism behind that, I guess, item. So after that, it struck me that there were thousands of more items like this, very sacred items that weren't necessarily on display at the museum. There's thousands that are in storage in dark rooms that might never be seen by people. They also repeatedly used the word collected to describe how they obtained these belongings, that they were collected by early explorers, when really we know that early explorers just would take and grab pretty much. This type of language was used in both museums, but the curator at the Pitt Rivers Museum was a little bit more open to learning and understanding more about what these sacred objects meant to us and how to handle them properly. What was her name again?
Laura Pierce.
Laura, definitely, she really wanted to learn from us rather than the British Museum. They were more trying to get us to learn, I guess. But although the Pitt Rivers Museum was a little bit more open, it doesn't change the fact that both museums house sacred objects that wouldn't necessarily be seen by the general public at all. These items would likely be buried or stored away or kept in families, not for just everybody to see. So the next one. So this inspired me to create a mock exhibition of what we would see of European people using the same language that we heard in the museums. So it looks weird that these things don't have names with them, but that's what I found in these museums. So some of these things that would be very precious to a lot of people, like a family heirloom that you could not imagine losing from your family. This is something that I thought was very similar to a lot of the sacred items that were in the museums. A lot of the artifacts and belongings didn't have any names or even direct cultures in them. So things like, it would be strange if we saw the Mona Lisa without a name with it, but that was how it was really. So a lot of paintings that I saw just had woman as a title. And a lot of the Indigenous paintings or paintings of Indigenous people didn't have names at all. It was just, there was nothing there. So I put some things that would be really uncomfortable and almost immoral to put in museums, like an urn with someone's ashes in it and stuff like that, and family photos. So things that just you wouldn't feel comfortable having in museums, just to try to flip that around a little bit. So I decided to call it Encountering Europeans, Cultures Frozen in History, because we often see the language like this used in museums, saying that this kind of language almost exoticizes the other culture, and cultures frozen in history means that no one's progressed, that they're stuck or they're in the past, which is really common when referring to Native exhibits. So I guess we can go on to the next one. So I used some of the language that I actually heard in both museums, and I wrote up a little mashup, I guess, of what my mock exhibit would have. If you take notice of the bolded red words, these are like a lot of the trigger, I guess, words that I heard in the museums. One thing that I heard repeatedly was that the British Museum does a lot of loans, which is ironic because they might not have, it's questionable how they even obtain those objects, so it's funny that they loan them out back to the communities, which was kind of odd. So yeah, this is just like a keepsake box that I found on the internet. That would be almost, it's comparable to what we saw of Indigenous items in the museums. Okay, the next slide. And this is us outside the British Museum. I chose not to enter the museum after our meeting with the curators because I felt really saddened by the fact that they have so many of our belongings and even human remains sitting in glass cases or in dark rooms in the back. So I could not go into a space like this out of support. That's why that photo in the beginning, you can actually do a Google Maps tour online. So that's where I got that photo from. This mock exhibit I came up with was supposed to unsettle and dislodge the politics and language within museums in order to show how backwards it really is. And I hope this presentation sheds some light on the issue and how important it is for museums to create strong relationships and ties to the communities of which objects they house, and how these positive relationships can, and repatriation can actually lead to more knowledge and teaching to happen within the museums. So I work with kids, so the biggest thing that I thought about the British Museum was that the museum is like a child who gathers all of the toys, although the toys don't actually belong with them or to him and doesn't share. But I hope that things will change for the British Museum because they do have such a space that they're able to teach so much. And I think that in the future, they can become even stronger by maintaining relationships with these cultures. So the museum, I guess, inspired me to do this. And I wanted to thank Coll and Tanya for giving us a safe space to have conversations and share our emotions and our findings and our research. Without them, this wouldn't have even happened. So thank you.
We've got just two more before we go into the Q&A session.
Okay, hi, I'm Lauren. I'm going into my 5th year in history. And so when I applied for this course, I was kind of like looking for the answer without knowing the words to it, like, why does history matter when there's so much going on in the present? Like, why does it matter that we have to learn these things at all? And so with that kind of mindset, I went on this trip, and just wanting to learn because there's so much that I did not know before going. So, but at the end, my biggest takeaway from our time together in London is that in any place you live or travel to, there, in my mind, should be an expectation that you're going to undergo some emotional and intellectual labor to understand the place in which you're learning and in which you're living. And so after spending time in London, a space that on the surface is very cosmopolitan and modern and doesn't need to be acknowledged that this is London, because it's a given, I came to find that there is really no default on what a place can be seen as, and instead requires to be honored with a lot of labor that you individually and as groups need to put in. So one major takeaway I got from our class together is that default thinking and assuming there's one set way is dangerous and dismissive, which sound I'm preaching to the choir, everyone knows that. But where one perceives a space is always perceived one way, when in fact there isn't a place on this earth that doesn't have layers and layers and layers of different stories and encounters from every kind of heritage, from every kind of individual. And so it is this assumption of a default look, meaning or experiences that proves through its harmful reproduction that there is an extreme need for all people to undergo this labor that I think as a class we really tried to do. And I was really grateful for the lot of effort that this class put in that regard. And then I really thought that this labor was important to do in a place like Britain, which is called the heart of empire, because London is not a place of purely white Anglo history as it's often espoused to be. And to passively accept it as much is to do a really great disservice to thousands of years of people's existence in that space that are not typically represented in the textbooks that we read. So in all places such as London, it should be the norm to wonder and figure out the many layers instead of just accepting the one layer that you see initially. And we as a group, I think, largely refuse to look at things with the awe that you're supposed to when you travel to London. You're supposed to see the palace and be like, whoa, that's great. But I think as a group, we were really trying to be critical and being this is a beautiful building, but what does it say beyond just being a really nice piece of architecture? Who has been here, who has had an impact on it, instead of just the name of the king that happens to reside there. And so even though I think a lot of us were still very impressed with the art that we saw, it was our responsibility as this class to not have an uncritical reverence for this place and instead think about what our place there meant and what the place of the people who were there throughout history was. So I think this need for this labor heightens the importance when one considers how much labor goes into the city already without acknowledgement of that. It's people from all over the world travel across the globe to see this place and to acknowledge the white history. So it's really shocking that you wouldn't go, and it's a great disservice and a historical inaccuracy to see the other histories in that place at the exact same time. So we kind of saw that when we did see it, we saw it with Tony, who gave us a Black London tour, and he was kind of using, through his refusal to only accept one type of history, a mode of decolonization and survival by showing that there's many layers that you can't just passively interpret. You have to delve deep. And the best part about the tour of Tony is that he wanted to engage and discuss instead of preach. And that was such a good takeaway, I think, for our group. And I was so excited to see that it was about collaborating and acknowledging different spaces within the same place that was really impactful about how we can start to understand history. So with Cole's lead and with Tony in mind, we each had to pick a site in London to interpret. And so then I picked the Canadian War Memorial, which, sorry. So this is where we did the tour of Tony. And then I picked the Canadian War Memorial, which is about 30 seconds to the right of Buckingham Palace. And it's not a very frequented monument by any means. We went on Canada Day, so there were more people than usual. But I picked this site because on first glance, it's just a war memorial. No one's named on it. It's just honoring the nation of Canada for its contribution to the Great World Wars. But what I noticed, what this reminded me of and what I saw throughout the city is that when we were walking through London, there was memorial and monument after monument, commemorating all of the great war heroes of the Great World Wars. But then there would be a few that'd be and then here's the women of the war, and then here's the animals of the war. And so these groups Indigenous people, women, animals, they were all got one monument that put them all in one group. But then every other monument in the city is this is the great general who did this, and this is and they're all white men. So I wanted to pick this site because this man, Francis Pagamongo, sorry, I'm so frazzled, but anyway. He is from Ontario, so he was a Shawanagan man who practiced Anishinaabe spirituality. And he initially enlisted in the First World War when he wasn't supposed to. Indigenous people were not allowed to enlist, but he still pushed through. And then he ended up being the most decorated war veteran of Indigenous descent, and then also the most deadly sniper in the war period. And he was supposed to get the Conduct Medal of Honor, but wasn't allowed to because of his race. But despite all of this racism he faced throughout the war, he still ended up a pretty high-ranking official. And what I liked about him is that, first off, he wasn't named anywhere in the city, despite being a huge reason that the war was so successful for this particular side. but also in all of his tents in which he was like a leader and like was planning military operations, he put the clan symbol of a caribou from his clan back home on his tents, so that everyone that served under and over him knew that he was Indigenous and from Canada. Not Canada, but like his nation within Canada. And so regardless of how people viewed him, they couldn't ignore his indigeneity. And I thought that was a really cool assertion of his agency, because that's a huge focus of what we did in this course. And I just thought that I needed to bring him up at this site because so many people in this city aren't named simply because they're not white men. Anyway, so back to like what does history matter kind of focus I had. I'd say by the end is that I realize I practice and love history because for me it's one of the most natural ways I can begin to unlearn many of the default assumptions I have about places and people I've studied growing up. So by seeking out scholars that write from perspectives unseen in my grade 12 history textbook, I tried to do the labor and read and explore the thoughts of others regarding their own experiences when otherwise aren't portrayed in like the mainstream history. But I think what really struck a chord with me on this trip is that history doesn't just come from PhD candidates and academics. History is in everyone's hearts and experiences, and you just kind of have to like open your ears to it. And I think like in every single interaction we had on this trip, good or bad, there was some form of history that we would not have gone just from reading from a textbook, and that was so important to me and making me realize that history in its many forms is a way to share humanity instead of exclusion. Anyway, and so that's what I hope to take away. Thank you.
And last but certainly not least, Sophie Dever-Johnson. Yes, I do that every time.
Bonjour, Gishkamanasi Indigenicas, Wabjeshin Dodem, Ne Shingaming Donjaba, Nishnave Quendao, Chimigwech, Musqueamug, Minwa, Mino Musqueaming. That was actually a bit of an experimental introduction. But I said, my Anishinaabe name is Ugishkamanasi. I am Martin Clan. I am from Neoshinigiming, which is the point of land surrounded by water, also known as the Chippewas of Nawash, unceded First Nation in Ontario. And I thanked the Musqueam people and their beautiful territory. I am a double major in First Nation Studies and Creative Writing going into my final semester this September. And when I thought about going to London, I thought it would be more of an intellectual journey or a diplomatic one. I'd be following people from my territory, such as Nani Bawikwe, who came to London to visit Queen Victoria, and to my own mother, who's gone to London for her research. And I also thought, like, I'm in creative writing. This would be a great place to, like, find things to write about. However, this ended up being a really spiritual journey. I practiced ceremonies in preparation for the trip, and while I was there, I did ceremonies while I was there, and so I'm going to talk about some of those moments. These moments of ceremony came out of heartbreak, like Faith said, and such a deep, heavy sadness, but also I felt such a sense of power and love and hope. And before I left, I went over to the Longhouse because my friend Danette here told me that there was a good place to get some cedar. And from the very beginning, I knew I wanted to have cedar with me. My people call it kijik. And I've been taught by my aunties and uncles about cedar as a medicine, that it's a protective and cleansing medicine. And we have a tradition of wearing cedar in our shoes when we go to grave sites and places of extreme power. And the first time I put cedar in my shoes was when we were in Gravesend visiting Pocahontas' grave. I also offered cedar to the rest of the group, invited them to put it in their own shoes or to use according to their own traditions. In Gravesend, I also offered sema, or tobacco, to Pocahontas. And for me, this turned the gravesite into a ceremonial space and a place that it probably hasn't been in a really long time. And Pocahontas herself was a woman of great ceremonial power, and I felt like I was really honoring her and coming into it as an Indigenous woman, visiting with another Indigenous woman. So that was really powerful for me, and having this leader, I also did feel protected. Another moment that really struck with me, and that I did a small ceremony for, was when we went to Craven Street, which is where that Odawa captive was taken that Coll mentioned. From the moment I stepped onto Craven Street and Coll told us where we were, I felt such a deep sense of heartbreak and loss, and I knew I had to come back and give Sema. And this loss and sadness, we don't even know his name, we just knew that he was an 11-year-old boy, and then after one incident, as entertainment, he finds a scalp that belonged to someone from his nation, and then he's like really upset, obviously. And then after that, he just kind of disappears from the archive. So on the next week, when I had time to myself, I went back to Craven Street, and I walked along the Thames, and I held Sema, and I visited with him, and I thought, would he have been comforted being so close to this river? And what would he have called the river? Would it have been like the rivers of our territory? And I said a prayer for him, and I consider him my cousin because he's Odawa and I'm Anishinaabe. And I just wanted to let him know that even though he was so far away from home, that he is loved and that we have not forgotten him. And if you could change the slide. And so I think the most powerful moment for me was when we went to the Pitt Rivers Museum. And I found myself face to face with a display case full of cradle boards and moss bags and things for carrying babies around in. And I thought about my beautiful niece who's here today, and the cradle board that she has that her mom and her auntie made. And it was made with so much love. And I actually made a cord bag that her umbilical cord is in, that hangs on the cradle board, and how much love and protection she has. And it has her totem on that bag, and it has strawberries and flowers, and that there's so much power and love there for this beautiful being who is in our world now. And then this cradle board really stuck out to me because of the exquisite beadwork. And I thought it was funny, it was just described as an Eastern Woodlands cradle board. It doesn't say the nation or anything. But also this heart that you can see carved up top there. And I thought these cradle boards were made with love. They were made to hold babies and teach them and protect them. And instead they're here and they're behind glass. And you don't know the last time a baby was in there or if they will ever hold a baby again. So there's such a specific purpose that they were made. And in my teachings, when you make something such a ceremonial spiritual object, the intentions are really, really important. But they're stuck there. So we did there were some ceremonial aspects of that day that I won't go into right now, but seeing this cradle board really connected me to our Anishinaabe traditions about pregnancy, birth, and child rearing, and my relations here, and my little niece, and the work I want to do as a birth worker after I graduate, and the cradle board that I will someday create myself. So Indigenous travelers, when they came to London, they did ceremonies. The Ojibwe visitors who went to the Great Medicine Cave. And I wish we had been able to spend more time there, but there's an opera concert going on that night, so we had to get out of there really quickly. And so when I came to London, I felt myself compelled to do my own ceremonies with the very limited knowledge and language that I currently carry for many reasons. But these ceremonies were a way for me to honor and embrace and remember those who came before us. Giving tobacco for that Odawa boy was a way for me to try and undo some of the harms done to him in his lifetime. And seeing those cradle boards confirmed my fierce interest and passion for birth work and justice. These ceremonies connected me to the past, forced me to think about my present and imagine a future. Before we left, I scribbled in my notebook that I was going to visit my relatives, and I feel like I really did. And I'm really thankful for our instructors and my classmates who I got to learn alongside and laugh with and see them do their own ceremonies and talk about their own traditions. And I'm just so happy Keiston is here. She's singing so sweetly. And Miga Trill for all being here. Thank you.
So now's the time when it's up to you to ask questions and build on some of the conversations that we've already hopefully started here. And I also did want to acknowledge Tanya Bob, whose idea this was in the first place. When she heard about the project that I was involved with, she said, First Nations and Indigenous Studies should make a class out of this. And so between her and Daniel Justice, it's really their fault that we had this experience. So thanks to
Coll
Tanya.
wrote the book. So.
Yeah, it was a team effort. So questions for the students, or for any of us, or comments?
I was just kind of wondering how you find the climate of the city and how other people interact with the spaces that you were interacting with without having the knowledge and the experience that you guys were having. I don't know, can you talk about what that was like?
Anybody want to jump in with that? What about, there's a lot to think about there. What about the other people we saw at Pocahontas's grave site? Do you remember?
The couple that those who were.
There was a lot of people that I think they didn't really either had no knowledge of any of this history beforehand. Like the first who really had of the Thames River, there was an elderly couple with us that were from the area but really hadn't heard any of the history before. So there was a lot of like really surprised faces. They were like the most. Dropped his jaw. A lot of things happened. And when we were at Gravesend, because Pocahontas' grave is located within the church or in the churchyard, people kind of just walk just to and fro, all like without any, I guess, recognition. Except I did see one elderly lady. She's probably like 90, and when she was leaving, she said, "Goodbye, Pocahontas," and smiled. So that was the only interaction I saw with.
The gravesite was almost like a shortcut. People were just like walking through it to get somewhere else.
Yeah.
It was just part of the landscape.
I also felt this like very personally. When I went over there, I actually got to meet for the first time, anybody in my family has met my dad's cousin on his side, so my grandfather's niece, and she had no idea I was Native, first of all. But she was like very excited that I was, and very sweet and like well-intentioned, but it was definitely like I could have taken that moment to be like give an education, but I was like, this is not the time. And so she was just very interested in culture, but like didn't really know any of the issues, and like was interested in my course and wanting to know, but like shocked about Indigenous people being taken there and like the history. She had no idea.
And my experience doing this for 3 or 4 years now in London and giving walking tours when I was there on sabbatical and so on is that the level of knowledge about just even the empire is so limited. There's a sense that it's almost been forgotten. And so, you know, I don't think we heard it on this trip, but certainly on previous trips that I've made there, I hear people use language like, oh, you mean Red Indians, right? This really dated language where it's completely square one. So almost anything that we're contributing to the story is new. And that's, I think, some of the power of these stories that we were working with is that they are really new angles for many people. Other questions or comments? Yeah.
You talked about the Black History tour that you did. Are there a lot of tours and such exploring alternate histories in London, or are those pretty hard to find?
Yeah, Sarah, did you find other examples of those?
I didn't go on any, but there's a guy who wrote a book called Rebel Footprints, and it's like all about different walking tours, so stuff about like suffragettes. I don't know like how intersectional those looks are, but there's definitely a lot of them, at least a few companies who do that sort of thing.
Walking tours in London are a big industry. There's tons of them, and I know there are Jewish walking tours. There are, I believe, Irish walking tours as well. The whole history of Irish presence that goes back hundreds of years, and a lot of them take place in kind of the same part of the city, in the East End, in the eastern part of the city. And what's interesting is that for us, Indigenous visitors often did not end up in those poor immigrant communities. They ended up at sites of power, You know, they ended up at Buckingham Palace, the Tower of London, St. Paul's Cathedral, and so on, because they were such prominent visitors. So it's a very different map from some of the other maps like Black London and so on. They don't necessarily intersect geographically all that much, which is an interesting thing to think about. It also means that a lot of the sites that Indigenous people encountered are still there for us to look at in a way that they might not be in other places. Yeah.
Sorry if somebody mentioned this when I was out, but I know you talked about the loan program from the museums. Were there any efforts from those museums to repatriate their objects at all?
What's your take on it?
The Pitt Rivers Museum was, I think, more, but what we kind of asked the British Museum, we tried to ask them that question, and it was a little bit danced around, I felt like.
Dempsey did the work for us.
Yeah, Tanya's dad was very much, it was funny, there was a part where one of the curators said, Dempsey, we have one of your carvings, and he went, how did you get that? It was like, everyone kind of just went quiet. I feel like when we asked that question, the British Museum, they kind of just said, well, we do loans, sort of things.
It's expensive.
Yeah, so it was, but the Pitt Rivers Museum was kind of more open that they are actually in the process of returning human remains back to the Maori people.
Yeah, it was different feelings at different museums. Like, you could tell that Laura at the Pitt Rivers Museum, like, if she had it her way, would have just like taken things out of cases and given them to us to take home. Whereas like we were preparing ourselves for meeting people at the British Museum, and Coll was like, let's try to get some questions that maybe aren't going to be about repatriation. So we did we got all these questions, and like we were going to try and stay away from it, because the moment we walked into that room and we got this PowerPoint, they weren't overtly defensive yet, but you could see like the tone was like protective of how they were feeling about keeping these things. And Dempsey asked, I think he's like, have most of the human remains been given back, or have they all been given back? And she's like, well, most of them. And it was, and so we were, then I don't know, it was different feelings. Definitely a little bit more defensive at the British Museum. We all were kind of angered as we were leaving there. It was almost like they were trying to fool us that the work they were doing was better than it is, because they made a point to put in their presentations that they had like Kwakwaki objects back on loan in their communities. And I think I looked at Owen at one point, and I was like so mad, and he was like, loan. We were really uncomfortable there.
Yeah, we talked about long-term loans, but we weren't sure what that meant.
There's also still a continued focus on making acquisitions there.
Oh,
so
yeah.
They actually haven't really changed their focus there to repatriation. They're actually still very interested in taking a lot of things.
And they said that their budget is laughable for how much they have to get more stuff and pile it on top of the thousands of things they already have.
Like 60,000 things are in storage rooms underneath it that are not even on display.
And with the British Museum, like there's actually a law, like the British Museum Act, that kind of, the whole repatriation thing in the British Museum is complicated because you have nations from literally everywhere trying to get their stuff back. Like Greece especially is trying to get the Elgin marbles. And I think if they kind of started one repatriation, then it was just kind of like...
Everybody would pounce.
They would have nothing left in the museum.
We read a wonderful poem by the Maori poet Robert Sullivan called London Waka, and waka is the canoe, the Maori canoe, and he talks about the waka coming up the Thames and lobbing bombs into corner pubs and emptying out the British Museum and making all these diplomatic relationships with a quarter of the world by giving back all those cultural objects and so on. And so you get a sense that the British Museum is a little bit under siege, you know,
Yeah.
and perhaps rightly so. I mean, as we've been talking about. But I really got a sense from them that if anybody starts getting things or cultural belongings back, then it just is going to unleash this whole emptying out of the museum. That certainly seems like that's the fear there.
Yeah.
There was a lot of fear, I think, in that presentation compared to the Pit Rivers, which even the body language of the curator we worked with, it was very much this kind of body language as opposed to sit behind a desk and give a PowerPoint. Again, I want to thank them for giving us a couple of hours of their time, which they certainly didn't have to do. So, it was a difficult thing to recognize their generosity, but also push a little bit too.
There was kind of the discussion at the end if we should like steal carrot cake.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah, I said
take that with us.
That was when we did a walking tour. I looked at Owen and I was like, you should steal a muffin. And I was like, then if they ask you to give it back, be like, well, I'll take my pole back.
Yeah, Musqueam.
Oh, I thought your presentation had given examples of if you change the situation entirely, of the remains inside. I thought it was a really good way of highlighting for people how it is for us to be these. Our cultural needs, our cultural belongings are on display without acknowledgement of even where it comes from, the people's, the makers is always a difficult issue. But your presentation and the Musqueam woman there.
Me?
Okay. Well, I went to London when I was 19 years old for some weird stuff I got caught up in with the Dundas collection, which was auctioned off in 2004, 2005. But I went to the Pit Rivers Museum and the British Museum at that time and made connections with Laura. And I'm so glad that Laura came across as she always does, such a generous woman. And if you're interested, I don't know if she said anything about it, but she's got a really powerful book out that she co-wrote with the Haida Nation, mainly Nika Collison, that just came out last year about their ongoing relationship and the many Haida ancestors that have been repatriated from the Pit Rivers Museum. But just your whole critique, all of you, of the museum complexes over there, between the Pit Rivers Museum and the British Museum, and your comparison of the two, I really enjoyed. And I think that international dialogue is good to see, because we have that in Canada and the US quite a bit, but everything that, all of the smoke and mirrors, it was just so delightful for me to see that you guys saw right through all of the smoke and mirrors, because the idea of short-term loans, the idea of long-term loans, what they're not telling you is that our people have to pay to get those on loan even, and the insurance alone, not including the shipping, transportation, making sure that our museums are up to their standards. It's a huge financial investment for us. So just to add kind of another dimension to what you're already seeing is a lack of true engagement, the idea of loans being something that it's just it's never enough. But that you guys saw right through. I just really thank you for your presentation.
Maybe a couple more questions and then we can break and people can kind of mingle and socialize a bit and you can talk to students individually.
I guess I'll throw a question out there, a general one. If you could go back to one site from this trip and spend more time, which one would it be? And how would you engage with it differently?
I was going to go to Westminster where those statues of the O'Dowell boy are, but when I went, the lineup just to buy a ticket to get in was so long and I had other things to do that I didn't make it in there, but I would definitely go back to Westminster and spend some time with those statues.
It would be interesting actually to think about Sophie or any of us going to Westminster Abbey. First of all, it's £20 to get in, so that's $40, right? And I think a lot of us were wondering why Anglican Church needs that kind of income. I think there was some critique there about that. But my sense is that we would not be able to do some of the kinds of ceremonial work that Sophie and others did in the group. I wasn't even allowed to take notes with my laptop when I was in there to sort of record what was on the monument. I almost got kicked out for doing that. And there is a tradition in London of not allowing Indigenous people in Christian spaces to actually do this kind of work. Another church that we engaged with called St. Olaf Hart Street, where 2 Inuit people were buried in the 1570s, the verger there made it very clear in 2013 that the Tahltan performance artist Peter Moran was not welcome to smudge or sing or drum or anything in that church. And so he and I and some other people conducted a ceremony there, an intervention, I guess, really, that was silent. But we were told specifically, you're not welcome to do that because, quote, you're in England now. And so it would be interesting to go back to Westminster Abbey and see what you could, quote, get away with.
Well, in St. Paul's, I went there just to look at stuff. It was kind of my tourist day, and I actually did put cedar in my shoes that day because of all the tombs that are there. And I didn't really, I think at one point I was walking through it, I was like, oh, I guess I'm doing a pagan thing if they knew what I was doing right now. Even just carrying medicine with me, they would not be impressed, so I feel like I kind of snuck it in.
For me, that felt like there was a lot of restrictions that are not going to go away about places that I just couldn't go. Not because I physically wasn't allowed to go, because it just didn't feel right walking down into the crypt underneath, walking over people's graves and having lunch. I just think that's so strange to me, and that is something that I really grappled with the entire time, and everybody kind of knew it. Going through different museums and seeing just people's remains, and I think I would have liked to go back there just to kind of honor them a little bit, because I can imagine how awful I would feel if my Sasnam ancestors were taken out of their burial place before we stopped it and put in a museum and just in a case. I would be so heartbroken and upset. And that's all I could think about being in those places, is these are somebody's people, and you've just got 6 skulls here with no acknowledgement of where they came from or who they belong to. So I would have liked to go back there to those places just to kind of be a little bit more mindful, because you got 90 kids running around really excited to see a skull and just gawked at. They're a really huge spectacle.
Maybe one last question. This is our first couple of seminars.
Yeah.
Well, if not, I wanted to make some thanks. First to UBC First Nations and Indigenous Studies, who made all of this possible. The staff support that we had putting today together, and just all along the way was really impressive. The UBC Department of History, which paid my way to go there, and UBC Go Global program, amazing program. They did a lot of the logistical work for us. It was just really fantastic. The UBC Faculty of Arts was quite interested in what we were doing and was broadcasting some of our Twitter, our tweets, and so on. And then I wanted to thank the people who we did meet with while we were there. So the British Museum and the Pitt Rivers Museum, obviously. Also the Royal College of Physicians, who had the John Dee exhibition. The London Walks Company, Black History Walks, and the British Library. These people are under, at many of these organizations, are under a lot of pressure for their time. Everyone around the world wants a piece of some of these organizations, as we've talked about, and so they were able to really give us a lot of time. But thanks to Tanya as well for, again, everything and being along with us and being our documentarian. She took how many photos? 2,000?
Well, that was my whole family.
Yeah.
We had about 600 of the trip, our trip.
Yeah, so it was nice to have someone along to document everything we were doing. And mostly, though, I want to thank the 8 of you for really stepping up. This was an intense class. None of us had really done anything like this before. I didn't entirely know what to expect. Thank you for putting up with my constant worrying about being on time and all that sort of thing. And that became the running joke that we were always showing up really early for things. There were a couple of times where I'm glad we did. For little logistical snafus, but it's been a really powerful experience for me as an educator as well to see the city through your eyes and to learn a lot from that experience myself. And thanks to all of you for coming today. Grab some more food, feel free to talk to students if you've got more questions, but mostly thanks to all of you for coming today. This has been a really good experience for us to sort of share what we did. So thanks very much.